One estimate this week said that GDP could shrink by a quarter if the strict measures last until June, and that is causing some to wonder how sustainable the current situation is. Well, to talk more about this, we're joined now by the man who led the Bank of England through the last major financial crash, the former Governor, Lord Mervyn King. Thank you very much for being on the programme this morning, Lord King.
Good morning,
So
Sophy.
how do you think the current economic fallout from the coronavirus will compare with that crash back in 2008?
I think they're very different. The current problems are, one, the lost incomes and output from the lockdown. Secondly, the indirect consequences of the lockdown in terms of not just of output, but the well-being and indeed health, because this is spread right across the economy. And the third, and perhaps the most worrying, is the potential loss of what economists call productive capacity. That is, the businesses that we will need to regenerate the economy. If they go out of business and fail during the lockdown because the government's measures don't work as intended, that will be a permanent impact on our ability to produce. So I think everything will depend on whether the government's measures work as intended.
And of course, from the interview that we did earlier with Alok Sharma, those loans not necessarily getting through to the companies requesting them as well. It's clear that you have some real concerns about the impact of the lockdown. How long do you think realistically it can go on for?
I don't think it's possible to put a simple time frame on it, but I think the government has a very difficult judgment to make in balancing these considerations. And I think it's very important that we realise that the science does not tell us what we must do. Science informs the judgment. The government has to make a difficult balancing judgment. I think, given that a vaccine is a long way away, an exit strategy is going to be a process of trial and error. I think it's sensible for the government to explain this very clearly. I think it makes sense to adopt measures which reflect the need to keep some element, maybe a large element, of social distancing, while recognising that social distancing is not the same thing as a total lockdown. If we can allow schools, young people, some businesses to start up, then while maintaining social distancing, then I think we achieve our objectives. But it's bound to be a process, I think, of trial and error.
It's interesting to hear you mention some of the suggestions that people have made about potentially reopening or lifting restrictions on parts of the lockdown. You mentioned schools there. Do you think that could be one early way to ease the lockdown? Or how about this report that we've heard about showing that perhaps people in their 20s may be allowed to resume almost normal activities?
So these are judgments which only the government can take. Science doesn't tell you what is the right thing to do. But I think it would be sensible for the government to be very clear about the difficulty of an exit strategy. I don't think it's sensible just to tell us all to stay indoors. I think the government can rely on the common sense of people and say to them, look, these are the challenges. We don't have a vaccine. There is no simple treatment. Once we start to relax the intense restrictions of the current lockdown, we do run a risk that there will be more infection spreading. It's sensible to try this amongst those groups of the population that are not apparently as adversely affected as the elderly and those with existing health conditions, in order to start a process of trial and error, because to maintain the lockdown has its own costs, not just economic costs, but costs in terms of the health and well-being of those affected by it.
Do you think then there's a tipping point where the risk of allowing the virus to spread a little more is outweighed by the negative consequences of the lockdown?
I don't think it's possible to make a precise judgment, and I don't like phrases like the tipping point. What I would say is that I think the best weapon the government has in this position, and it's a very difficult position for government, let no one be any doubt about it, there is no easy answer, is for the government to be very honest about this, honest and open, and explain the difficulties. And I think the best weapon the government has is probably the common sense and instinct for self-preservation of the British public.
Now, of course, whatever happens, there's going to be a major economic rebuilding effort after we are finally kind of emerging from what we're in at the minute. After the last crash, there was a decade of austerity to follow. We just spoke to Keir Starmer there, who said that can't be allowed to happen again. But in your view, will there need to be some kind of austerity, whether it's spending cuts or tax rises, to try and recover? Or do we need to actually just get used to living with a lot more debt?
Well, I don't think we should worry today about the extent to which the national debt will rise, provided we can start to get the economy back to function sooner rather than later. Once we get into, say, next year and we see by how much the national debt has risen, then we just have the opportunity to run a prudent fiscal policy in order that slowly and gradually over time, the ratio of that debt to our national income will fall back to the levels we have today. I think it is worth adding that one of the benefits of being prudent about the public finances in the last decade is that we're in a position today where it's much easier to absorb a significant rise in the national debt.
Um, in the interview with the Business Secretary, Alex Sharma, he told us that just 1.4%, 4,200 applications for the business loan scheme had actually been granted. It seems like quite a low number, an alarming number. Are you concerned about that, or do you think the economy will be able to rebound quite quickly once we're through this pandemic?
Well, I am worried about it because the economy will recover quickly only if we can keep the businesses that existed at the beginning of it still functioning and still able to pick up the reins when the epidemic is over. And I think the worry, and it's a worry not just about the business loan scheme and the economic policy in general, it's also a worry about testing, is that the issue is not about high level decisions or what politicians say, it's about making things happen on the ground. And I do think, for example, that if we find so few uh, business loans being granted, something has gone wrong. I did think myself that it was a mistake to close the local bank branches that could have been able to function with social distancing, to respond to the queries and claims for the business interruption loan scheme. Because as we learned in 2008, the banking system is an essential part of the economy, just as the health system we see today is. So that's one of the areas where I think we do need on the ground to worry about the delivery of the programs. I think this is not a time to quibble about the policies announced by the government. It is a time to make sure that what is supposed to happen actually gets delivered on the ground.
OK, Lord Mervyn King, thank you very much for being on the show this morning. Thank you.
Thank you.